Welcome to For the Love of Language. I'm Stacy the Linguist.
And I'm Authentically EJ, and we're super excited to talk today about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis.
Yeah, and for the record, this is another super podcast exclusive little thing. My little Twitch stream is on a bit of hiatus, and so you're going to be getting a few different podcast exclusives. But make sure you do follow me on Twitch, Stacy the Linguist, for other updates and for future recordings. But yeah, today we are going to talk about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. EJ, do you want to tell us a bit about what that even is?
Yeah, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is the idea that the languages you speak impact the way you think. And if you take it to the extreme, it would be like the languages you speak determine what you're capable of thinking. Most
Mm-hmm.
people have moved away from that extreme. And I think there's a much more interesting discussion if you talk about the nuances of, how language might actually impact how you view the world.
Yeah. So like you said, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, from a linguistic standpoint, from like a researchy standpoint, from a theoretical standpoint, is inherently false. Just because if just like any theory, you kind of have to push it to see where or if it breaks. And if it does break, then it is like false, and you got to rethink some things. But there are some elements that are true. So it is inherently a false hypothesis, but there are some aspects of it that are true. So again, if you push the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis too far, you get stuff like what you see in the movie Arrival, where all of a sudden you can see the past, present, and spoilers for Arrival. All of a sudden you can see the past, present, and the future just because you learn a different language, right? Saying that you can like reshape your mind depending on the language you learn. And so that is inherently false. When it comes down to it, we all think almost the same. There is neurodivergency, but language essentially functions the same in all human cognition. That's kind of like the job of language, is to function the same across all humans so we can all, connect with each other and communicate. And so to say that like your brain like wires itself differently to accommodate a language, or that you perceive things differently than other people because of the language you speak, is false.
Right. I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit because
Okay.
I think like that's also a little bit of an extreme viewpoint on one side, because everything that you learn does impact your brain and the way that you
Hmm.
think and the way that you perceive the world. Now, whether you say that that's actually like language, or whether it's the social constructs and what people teach you when they teach you the language, I think is really an interesting discussion as well. But I think there are things that people learn along with their languages that do impact how they think. I don't think it determines how they think or what they're capable of thinking, but I
Yeah.
think it does impact, maybe in subtle ways sometimes, the ways that people view the world.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I would agree with that. Again, we are like, that's the thing with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. You have to push it to see where it breaks apart. But like you said, there are elements of it that are true. So a common example that's used when people are teaching the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in like universities and stuff is that there are 13 Inuit words for snow. There are 13 different Inuit words for snow. For the record, there's also a language, a Nordic language that has like 31 different words for snow, right? There's like slushy snow and puffy snow and fast falling snow, like, all that kind of stuff. And we can express those in English. They just have specific words for them in these other languages.
I just want to add in that a lot of these claims about multiple words in different languages are actually disputed.
And so those are like the classic examples. And so people are like, oh, you must be able to perceive all of these different types of snow because you have words for them in your language. And it's like, that's not really true. Like human perception is capable of distinguishing all of these different things. It's not because of your language that all of a sudden you see these different types of snow. All of those different types of snow existed. It's just it was valuable to the community. It was valuable to the people to have specific words to distinguish those types of snow. And again, yeah, and again, it's one of those things where we can still communicate those ideas in English. It just takes a couple more words, which isn't a bad thing. It's just a different thing.
Definitely. Yeah, I think the snow example is really interesting. And it kind of pinpoints one of the cruxes, I think, of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and where it does break down. Because a lot of the time, these examples point to single words like snow in English versus, in Icelandic and Inuit, you have like very specific words, but having a single word versus having to speak around something, it doesn't mean you can't express it, but it does mean, maybe when you talk about snow, maybe when you're communicating, you're always more specific. Like, for example, in Chinese, if you need to talk about a brother or a sister, there's no word for just brother or sister. It has to be an older brother or a younger brother, and an older sister or a younger sister. And so suddenly it's impossible to communicate without that added, information and those extra connotations that age is going to bring along with it. And so as far as like a communication standpoint and maybe a memory standpoint as well, it might be easier to remember and categorize some things depending on the words that you have for them.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to like distinctions between languages, like in general, where depending on the values that the community has or the needs of the community, the language is going to shape around those, right? So there are a lot of I think we might have talked about this before. There are a lot of kinship terms in Australian languages. That's something that's like very iconic. Is they have a lot of very like highly specific kinship terms. Your verbs have to agree in like kinship terms. Like you have to say in one Pamanyungan language, you have to conjugate your verb to let people know if you're talking about second or third person, if that person is your sibling or not. Like that's part of your verb conjugation, which is kind of weird. But it's what the community needed. Those kinship terms are like highly valued. And so that information needed at some point to be encoded into the language. Now, does that mean that they see more kinship terms or they necessarily think that everything revolves around siblings? No, not necessarily. Again, that's where like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis breaks down. We can see, that the values of the community guided that, and there is sort of a more of a focus on those things, and we can see that linguistically. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they have more kinship terms or they see things only in kinship terms, right? So there's a million different examples we could go on and on about this with.
I also really like how you called out, there is the chicken and egg question here of is it the society and the cultural constructs that are forming how the language is created, or is it the language that's influencing those social and cultural constructs? And I think you do have a little bit of both, because like we're not creating our own new language every new generation and every time we speak. And so the very fact that, schools and parents are teaching their children with the existing language means that having to teach with that system is going to have some impact on how people perceive the world. And like they are going to be putting things into those categories. But those categories did probably ultimately derive from social constructs and from culture. I think a really interesting one, and we absolutely need to do a total podcast just on this subject. But a super interesting one, in my opinion, is gender in language.
Yes, absolutely.
For example, in English, we only have gendered third person singular pronouns that are widely accepted.
Now, I'm not referring to the singular they that's been used for centuries to refer to someone when you don't know their gender. That is widely acknowledged. But what I'm referring to is when you do know you're talking about a specific individual and deliberately referring to them as they in the singular, that's a more recent usage.
So when you're referring to someone, it's generally he or she. Now, there obviously are non-binary individuals, and they is becoming more accepted, which I think is awesome, and we should be embracing that. But for a very, very long time, people have always categorized people into those two buckets, no matter, what the negative impact of that might be. And so a lot of people have difficulty moving away from that construct versus in Finnish, there is no he or she. There's just one singular third person pronoun. Chinese is another really common example.
Yep.
There's one word for he or she, although Chinese is different in that the written form of those words actually is gendered, but the spoken form isn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we can talk all about this. I personally have been doing a little bit of research about gender and gendered language, and specifically about why they has become the main pronoun for talking about genders outside of the binary, for non-binary genders, or other genders outside the binary, essentially. And so we can definitely talk all about that. I'm more than happy to share why that's the case, why they has really kind of like risen up, and why nuo pronouns have kind of, they haven't caught on as well. We can talk all about that some other time.
Definitely. But I think there is, just also more broadly related to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that those categorizations that a language has and that people have accepted do have an impact on how people are willing to speak, how people are willing to accept these ideas. I had a friend in my master's program who was a native Spanish speaker, and something that she was really passionate about was, how gendered Spanish is, and that she wanted it to move away from that.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. Again, we can talk about this in a completely different episode about gendered language and about the difference between grammatical gender and its impacts on like sexuality and gender, and how they are connected and how they are disconnected, and we can talk all about that. But I guess that brings us to a larger point about language change. And like you said, it is kind of a chicken and egg thing with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, figuring out, okay, are the values of the community changing the language, or is the language changing the values of the community? And I personally would argue that and I've said this a million times on Twitch, and I'll say it a million more times. Language is a tool. Language is inherently a tool. We are human primates, and we use tools, and language is one of those tools. And so we can change it and shape it into what we want. And as a tool, it is perfectly amoral. Language is not good, language is not bad, language is perfectly neutral. It is what we want it to be. And so while it's easy for us to say that, oh, language is hard to change, language doesn't change, like this is just going to be how it is, that's inherently false. If you think about the difference between modern English and Shakespearean English, you would know that there's a big difference. And those differences came slowly over time as society shifted, as language change happened, as language contact happened.
Definitely.
It's one of those things. Yeah.
I definitely agree. And like, I think a big distinction there is just that while it changes, it usually changes slowly. And I think that has changed in the last decade with the internet and with how quickly the news and social media spread ideas and norms. Like, I think the change that we're having right now with the acceptance of non-binary pronouns is probably much faster because
Yes.
of that widespread, ability to share knowledge across the world than
Hmm.
several other language changes have happened over, the last thousands of years.
Yeah. From a sociolinguistic standpoint, for just to kind of explain that a little bit, sociolinguistics is basically you take sociology and you take linguistics, you smash them together. So you're basically studying how certain sociological factors, age, gender, socioeconomic status, all that fun stuff, how that impacts language and vice versa. So from a sociolinguistic standpoint, historically, language change has happened really slowly, and there is sort of like a hierarchy of who uses novel terms and then how those novel terms become accepted. And we've kind of had to toss those out the window since the internet came about because things are changing. Like it's a brand new landscape. Like things people aren't just using new words with their small groups, with their small communities. They're getting shared, and if they go viral, they can be all over the internet, and then all over the world. And so that language change has drastically, uh, like we're trying to figure out, us linguists, we're trying to figure out exactly how language change is happening these days because it happens so fast.
Right. I think it does provide some really, really interesting questions. Like maybe in another 10 years, we'll be looking back and be able to really clearly say, these things that were happening in the world in the 2020s impacted the language in these ways. And I think we can say that already for, past years, more easily with some things than for others. Like the
Yeah.
word selfie obviously is a word that was just created because we had this new concept with portable cameras and everybody easily being able to post pictures online.
Mhm.
And so language adapted to our cultural norms. And
Yeah.
then because the word became a thing, then that idea was also more easily spread and impacted the cultural norms more. So you do have, I think, a
Yeah.
little bit of a cycle here.
We do, definitely. And for the record, we are post-pandemic. I mean, I say post-pandemic. We are still in the middle of a pandemic. Um, but in recent years, humanity has been dealing with a pandemic. And it's going to be a very interesting point for language because of the internet and because it's a global pandemic, not just like a smaller, like localized one. Language is already changing because of it, and linguists are already studying how the pandemic has affected like language, and come 5, 10 years from now, we'll be able to reflect back with maybe a little bit more nuance and see exactly how that goes down. So big worldwide events are now impacting not just English but like the whole of human language as well. And so stuff like that is a big tragedy, but it's also quite fascinating for linguists to maybe get a better grasp of how language is changing in this rapidly developing world.
Yeah. And I think there's other examples of that as well. Like the spread of computers and cell phones spread a bunch of new ideas with apps and technology that suddenly languages across the world needed to accommodate and deal with. I think COVID is definitely top of everybody's minds right now, and we could probably spend a lot of time diving into that a lot more too. I think something else that's interesting is also, people trying to use language to change people's opinions. Like we've talked about
Yes.
how this naturally occurs, but there's
Yes.
definitely like companies go out of their way to use language to change people's minds about their
Hmm.
products. I think an example that comes to mind is diamonds are forever, and
Hmm.
how, an advertising campaign with a super catchy slogan suddenly made most Americans want diamonds in their wedding rings.
Yeah. Yeah, you're 100% right. Language isn't, like we said, it's a tool and it's a very powerful tool. And a lot of people, especially in marketing and in other sales campaigns, I, for one, worked in retail for a while. I sold wedding dresses at one point, and let me tell you, the language you have to use to get people emotionally invested in your product enough to buy it is very it's crazy, honestly. The fact that you can kind of twist people's perceptions of things just by the language that you use and the words that you choose and how you say it. If you think about like your favorite jingle or like phrases that come into your head all the time, they've been perfectly crafted to be like just earworm feed. It just like feeds on your brain. Because there are certain patterns and there are certain things that our brains latch onto where we're like, ooh, yeah, that does sound really good. There's like the inherent prosodic pattern, the way like the rhythm of how it sounds, the consonants and vowels that you use are just like tailored so perfectly to stick inside of your brain.
Yeah. And even if like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is fundamentally false, I think it's interesting to see like where people believe in it.
Hmm.
So for example, there's a lot of people who go out of their way to learn languages because they want to read books in their original language, even though a translation fundamentally, if it's written by a skilled translator, should be capturing everything about the work
Yeah.
from the actual meaning to the tone and the connotations, finding matching idioms. Like a good translation is going to do all of those things. And yet there's still people who want to read works in the original language.
Yeah, that's very true. And there are a bunch of people who are also adamant about learning more languages, thinking that it makes them more cultured inherently. I've met a couple of polyglots in my time who very much believe that, and they think that just because they learn a language, that means that they understand that culture. And again, that's not entirely true because a culture is so much more nuanced than just the language that it uses.
Definitely. I do think that that gets a little bit muddled as well
It
because
does.
most language classes are also cultural classes.
Yes, they should be. They really should be because language is nothing without the culture and vice versa. But with the internet being so accessible, people are kind of taking languages out of context, and then assuming that they understand the culture because they know the language. I feel like that's more of a modern issue.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot to that. And I think maybe some of the ways that people approach language learning also, contribute to that problem.
Hmm.
But yeah, it is a super, super interesting thing because like being a polyglot myself and having learned like, I grew up moving every 2 years to a different country and having to learn a new language, even though I did go to international and American schools. So like school was usually in English, but I was always learning other languages.
Hmm.
And like I do think I gained a lot from that experience. But tons of people live in other countries for years and years and years. In like the State Department or I think the military, we have the term Little America for
Hmm.
communities overseas that are basically isolated communities that act as though they're part of the US still. And so you can live in another country for years and still only be interacting with Americans
Hmm.
and never actually get a grasp on the local culture. And where that really comes from is, yes, in language classes where you do specifically address cultural things, but that's not necessarily tied to the language, like Stacy said.
Yeah.
And then also just from actually talking and communicating with people from other places. But to do that, it doesn't matter if you're speaking their language or they're speaking your language, or even if you're code switching or one person speaking one language and the other person speaking the other. The important thing there is just the connection and the communication.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. places like that are fascinating. I mean, people have places like that all over the place. You think about like Chinatowns and Koreatowns and all that other fun stuff.
Right. Yeah. I'm using the US as a few
Yeah,
examples here, but I don't
yeah.
restrict it to that at all for sure.
Absolutely, yeah. It is very fascinating when people can like live in a country and kind of block them. I wouldn't say, but they can kind of cut themselves off from the rest of the world. Um, it reminds me of when I was a teacher, when I was teaching English as an additional language, and there was one student who, even though he attended most of the classes, he never got out of the beginner's level because he just refused to learn English. He just did not want to do it and found every excuse not to. And I mean, we could have a whole other podcast episode about motivation and about how motivation is probably the number one reason that people do or do not learn a language.
Right. I think there's also like another big one is just people don't know how. Like there's
Yeah.
people who put in hours and hours and tons of time, but they haven't been taught how to learn a language. But that's
Yeah.
yeah, we can dive into that.
We can, yeah, we'll go in. We're gonna have like a whole subsection. This is just a highlight for just a little preview for all y'all. We are gonna have like a little sub series about language learning, including language learning apps. Which language learning app is the quote unquote best? What is a good way to learn a language? Which language might be easier or harder for some people to learn? We'll dive into all of that, and some of the pros and cons of that. But going back to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, is there any other places where we maybe see that creeping up in our everyday lives or in people's perceptions of language?
Honestly, I think it is exaggerated. Like even the examples we give, there's usually a few cliche examples. Like you said, there's specific words like snow that are specifically culturally relevant in one language, but most words in most languages do have a direct translation in
Mhm.
another language. There are things like colors that languages define differently. There's gender that's used differently. Like there are a few points that stand out, but I think we did cover like the basis of it. And I think my big takeaway is just, if people are saying the languages you speak determine how you can think, they're absolutely wrong. Does it have a little bit of influence because of how you learn the language and the culture that you're taught along with the language? I would say definitely.
You just reminded me of an additional example, another very popular one that you learn in like Linguistics 101, if you're attending a university class, if you've remembered the language Paraha, which is a language spoken in South America in somewhere in the Amazon jungle. It was discovered by someone, and they said that, oh, they don't have number, they don't have color, they don't have all of these things that we see as like inherent to language, and that was like a support of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Oh, these people they don't have a way to like count things, and so they're like inherently bad at math or something, or they don't have a way to describe it, and so they're inherently bad at that. But that example has been super disproven because a white man came in and tried to document the language and did a really bad job of it, honestly. People have gone back and they've studied the language, and they're like, actually they do have this and they do have that. And it also kind of supports this idea of what we've been talking about with like translation. There are ways, there's always a way to get your point across in any language. There may not be a specific word for it, but there is a way that people can talk about it. That's one of the beautiful things about language, is it is inherently creative. If there's not a way to talk about it with like a single word, there are other words that you can use, or you can use your power of reference to talk about certain things. So yeah, you might not be able to say the word scarlet, for example, in French, but you can definitely say something along the lines of like deep blood red or something, right? There's always a way that you can
Right?
kind of talk about things,
Yeah.
and languages will do that, even if they
Mhm.
don't have a single word for it. again, like you were saying, a good translator knows that there's always a way to get the same idea across.
Definitely. And there's actually a name for that. It's strategic competence is what it's usually called, where, even if you're learning a language, you don't need to know every word to be successful. Like if you're able to talk around something and explain something, that is strategic competence. And I think we use it in our first languages all the time. Like how often do you forget words? How often do you have to talk around things? And so it's natural that would also come into play when we're talking about other languages. With your example of Piraha, that just really stands out to me as an egregious case of like language prestige and like discrimination coming into studying other languages, that we have maybe preconceived notions that our language is superior, which is total bullshit, right?
No. It's absolute total bullshit. And that language, when it was like discovered and documented and everything, it like it's the perfect poster child of everything not to do when you encounter a new language or a new group of people. It's the poster child for what not to do and the assumptions you should not make. And how, you do need like well documented data before you can just go around saying that people who in this culture cannot do this and they cannot do that because of XYZ in their language. Like, oh, that's a big no-no.
And I think it also just highlights how important collaboration is in general in linguistics. Like language is fundamentally a social science.
Yes.
Like you can't do linguistics on your own. You need to be working with native speakers and with experts who really do know what they're talking about.
Yeah. And sharing and collaborating on data and data sets is you have to do it. You just have to. Otherwise, you totally might make the wrong assumptions about a language, build a theory around it, and before you know it, someone comes along and is like, hey, that's just wrong for X, Y, and Z reason. That happens a lot. Which is why linguists, there are people out there that are called field linguistics, and their job is to basically just go out and collect data, work with native speakers, and build corpora, however, whatever the plural is. Build massive corpora that people can learn from. It's hugely important when we're making assumptions about stuff like that. But yeah, going back to the strategic competence, one of my favorite examples is my French professor. One of my French professors told me this. She was it was either her or a student was having a hard time. They didn't know the word for skull in French. The skull, like the bones under your head. So they couldn't find the word for it. So how are they going to get this point across? Head without meat. They used the phrase "head without meat." What's a head without meat? Well, that's your skull. And
wow, that's beautiful.
It was so beautiful, and I will never forget that example. And that just goes to show that, like, there are ways to talk about things. There's always a way to talk about things, and we can get those ideas across. And it's not that this person didn't have a concept of bones or how bones function, right? They knew what they wanted to say. They just didn't have the word to say it, and so they found a new way to do it. And that's essentially how it goes in every language. There are certain things that you value, but there's always a way to talk about whatever it is you want to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. I think we covered a really broad spectrum of, things related to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis as well as explaining it directly. So do you have any final thoughts, I guess?
I guess my final thoughts, and to just kind of wrap us up, is if you hear about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, yes, it is inherently false. But there are some truths that we can learn from it. It was a popular theory for a reason, and that's because it did give us some insights. And it is kind of fun to like build little fantasy worlds around it, like in the movie Arrival, and we can talk more about that sometime. Because it's it's one of the only films about linguists, and anyway,
it's a good one.
It's a good one. But it is kind of built built around that hypothesis. But yeah, so I guess that's just kind of like our final wrap up is there's always something to be learned, even when a theory is proved incorrect. And it can give us insights into ourselves. Even if you try to push it to its limits, it tells us about the human capacity.
Yeah. And I think the discussion also draws out a lot of just really interesting things about languages in general. So
Yeah.
awesome. Thank you for listening. Do follow Stacy the Linguist on Twitch to see our live recordings in the future.
And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at For the Love of Language. So you can
Underscores.
And with underscores for underscore the underscore love underscore of underscore language. It's something like that. There's a lot of underscores
between all the words.
Yes. But make sure to follow us there so you can stay up to date for when we release new episodes, because they will get released and they are coming out.
I'm also planning on sending out a quick survey before our next podcast to get people's thoughts on the hardest language, and then we'll dive into that discussion. So we'll see you then.
Buckle up, everyone. Thanks for listening.